Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gunslinger's Guide to Avoiding Matrimony by Mclean. Narrated by Holly Adams. Chapter 1. If there was one thing Adam Brady was good at, it was making monumentally asinine decisions that landed him in a world of hurt and regret. And he was almost 100% certain he was making another one. Then again, he didn't have much of a choice, because thanks to his last asinine decision, namely an ill-advised entanglement with a beautiful woman of dubious character, he was on the run for his life. Again. Now he was riding through the Colorado wilderness to God knew where. He hadn't seen a town or ranch or another human soul in 2 days. On the one hand, that wasn't a bad thing. It meant he'd shaken that damned Marshall Spurlock off his trail and was probably safe for the time being. But he couldn't keep wandering aimlessly forever. He'd run out of food the night before, and while he'd be able to find water, he was getting mighty tired of sleeping in the dirt beside a grumpy horse. He needed some real shelter. And a meal. And, if the aroma coming from the direction of his armpits was any indication, a bath. A man should be able to distinguish between his own scent and that of his horse. When another 2 hours of riding had brought nothing into sight but more hills and trails that led nowhere, his hope of finding anything resembling civilization faded. He sighed and dismounted, needing to stretch his legs and work out his numb backside for a few minutes. He'd only taken 3 steps before his boot caught in a hole, and he tumbled ass over head, landing on his face. "Ow!" he groaned, pushing himself up to see what he'd tripped in. He frowned, looking down at the hole, the deep, oddly square-shaped hole. His eyes searched the brush around him until he saw what looked to be an old post that might have been used in part of a fence. Or signpost. And beneath the overgrown brush and grass he could just make out the faint presence of an old trail. Huh. "Come on, Barnaby." He straightened his hat and tried brushing the dust from his pants, a lost cause at this point, before mounting again. "Maybe we'll find some place with a roof we can sleep under tonight, after all." The horse blew out a nostril full of air and plodded forward. He wasn't much of a conversationalist. Adam changed their course and followed the direction the old trail would have led. There might be nothing at the end of it, but even if it was an abandoned ranch or settlement, he'd take it. He kept his eyes and ears open, watching for any sign of an elusive house or town. After another mile or so, he reached an apple orchard and pulled up, stuffing his pockets and saddlebags with the fruit. At least he'd get to eat that night. He munched as he rode, keeping to the outskirts of the orchard. He still hadn't seen a scrap of anything to show that any of the land he traveled through was owned by anyone, but better to be safe. And then the vegetation grew sparser. He emerged from the orchard to find a well-worn trail that he followed to the top of a small hill. His heart thudded as he pulled to a stop, gazing down at the town that loomed ahead of him. Well, loomed was a bit of a stretch. There wasn't much to the town. Several homesteads dotted the small valley the main town occupied. The town proper seemed to have a general store, a tavern that looked to be doing good business, a blacksmith shop, barber's shop, and a 2-story structure that was under construction and little more than the studded walls at the moment, though it did have a fully finished roof. Odd. "Where the hell did this place come from?" he muttered. Barnaby didn't have an answer. Neither did Adam. If it hadn't been for tripping in that old signpost hole, he'd never have found the place. There had been nothing, anywhere, to indicate a town was down there. Yet there it was. He nudged Barnaby into motion again, taking his time getting to the town. The closer he drew, the more heightened the tension in his body became, until he had to force himself to relax his grip on the reins. He kept on high alert as he rode into town. The people he passed stopped and stared at him. They weren't hostile, more curious and wary. Given the location of their town, they probably didn't get many strangers riding through. That was both good and bad for him. Good because it meant he should be safe there. Bad because his presence was going to stand out. And standing out was the last thing he wanted to do. There appeared to be something of a celebration going on in the town square. He'd steer clear of that, thank you very much. He did not like celebrations. Or organized joviality of any sort. Or people, really, not to put too fine a point on it. He used to. In fact, he used to be a downright delight. Couldn't get enough of crowds and conversation. But at this exact point in time, people were danger. A man could just never be sure who might be in a crowd. Safer to just avoid other folks altogether. Unfortunately, he didn't see a way around what looked like most of the town's residents clogging the street. The tavern was his best bet for answers about the town, but that was where the largest group was gathered. Maybe he could blend in long enough to get his bearings and slip out before anyone noticed. He tied Barnaby to a post in front of the general store and tugged his coat into place, slapping at it a few times. The cloud of dust that emerged went straight up his nose and set off a sneezing fit that drew more attention than was healthy for him. He swiped at his nose with a somewhat clean hanky, then made sure the chain on his pocket watch hung straight. 3 days in the saddle was taking a toll on his carefully curated wardrobe. He scratched at the half-week's worth of beard grown on his cheeks and grimaced. Hopefully tonight he could find some decent lodging and start setting things to rights. A trip to the barber would be the first thing on his list. Adam paused, letting another man enter first, before he pushed his way into the bustling establishment. He slid onto a bar stool farthest from everyone else, hiding behind the crowd as much as he could. "What can I get you, mister?" the barkeep asked. Adam pulled his hat down low over his eyes and ordered a mineral water. A stiff shot of whiskey sounded better, but keeping his wits about him seemed like a good idea. The barkeep chuckled when he pushed Adam's glass toward him. "I think the only other person in town who orders straight mineral water is the sheriff," he said. Adam just grunted, but his stomach dropped. There was only one other man he'd ever met who never drank anything but straight mineral water, but there was no way that man would be sheriff of some hole-in-the-wall town, of any town, even if he was somehow still alive, which, as far as Adam knew, he was not. "You're new in town." It wasn't a question, and it confirmed that these people didn't see strangers all that often. Adam nodded but avoided eye contact, hoping the barkeep would leave him be. No such luck. "You mind telling me how you came to be here? Desolation isn't the easiest place to find." Adam's head jerked up at that. "This is Desolation?" The barkeep frowned a little. "You didn't know?" Adam shook his head, his thoughts spinning like a bored dog chasing its tail. "I was just riding and sort of found you. Didn't realize this place actually existed. Heard stories here and there, but none credible enough that I'd have thought to come looking." The barkeep nodded. "Good. We like to keep it that way. Gotten more than our fair share of strangers the last couple years." Adam frowned at that, though his attention wasn't really on the barkeep anymore, but on the implications of being in the notorious town of Desolation. "If you're planning on sticking around, you might want to stop by the sheriff's office," the barkeep said. "Town council's got some rules the newcomers gotta follow." "Interesting." "Thanks," Adam said, lifting his glass before quickly downing it. "I'll do that." He pushed off his stool and headed back outside to Barnaby. Looks like he needed to go see the sheriff to hear whatever these rules were, because if this really was desolation, he absolutely wanted, no, needed, to stay. It might just save his sorry ass. Despite the citizens of Desolation taking some obvious pains to keep their location off the map, word had slowly trickled through the dark corners of the western states and territories that the little town was a safe place for retired, let's call them ne'er-do-wells, criminals was such an ugly word, who weren't, criminals anymore. Pardon, who were ne'er-do-wells who wanted to start doing well? E'er-do-wells? Anyhow, thieves who were done thieving, drifters who were done drifting, gamblers who were sorta done gambling, gunslingers who were ready to hang up their guns. If any of those applied to a person, word was Desolation was safe. The town supposedly had a soft spot for folks with a dark past who wanted to live in peace. And if that didn't fit Adam to perfection, he didn't know what did. If there was one spot on Earth that he'd have an actual chance of evading the long reach of Marshal Spurlock, Desolation was it. Spurlock wouldn't put any faith in the tales of Desolation, if he'd ever even heard of it. The few stories Adam had heard had been whispered behind closed doors, and even then only rarely. No, if Adam was really in Desolation, he was probably safe. And for the first time in months, he took a long, deep breath and let it out again, then looked around his new town with a smile. Despite the crowd, nothing much seemed to be going on. Folks were just milling about. He caught snippets of conversations here and there about nothing much in particular. Someone who looked to be the town preacher stood with a small group on the raised sidewalk. Maybe it was a prayer meeting or some fire and brimstone Bible thumping. Not usually his type of gathering, but he could probably use a bit more religiosity in his life at the moment, considering his circumstances. Though something about the whole setup didn't sit right with him. He wiped his suddenly sweaty palms on his pants. Maybe he should— "All right, quiet down," a voice boomed. Adam's gaze flashed to the man in front of the tavern, all that beautiful peace that had been coursing through his veins instantly disappearing. A feeling not unlike when he'd jumped into that ice-cold lake a few weeks ago and his balls had sucked so high into his body he'd nearly lost them altogether. He cursed under his breath as the unfamiliar sensation of butterflies ripped through his stomach. He wasn't exactly lily-livered in most circumstances, and certainly wasn't proud of it in this case. He'd faced down more than his fair share of men literally gunning for him, and obviously had lived to fight another day. But, thanks to his ridiculously terrible intuition, he now had a whole new worry to deal with. Of all the towns in the West he could ride into with his tail between his legs, he had to go and pick the one that was apparently inhabited by none other than Gray Quickshot Woodson himself, a notorious gunfighter who, by all appearances, had become the town sheriff? Damn it all, the barkeep had been talking about him. Shock and terror aside, Adam had to stifle a laugh. One, because of all the people in the world who'd end up becoming a lawman, old Quickshot was the last Adam would have picked. Two, if that were true, well, suffice it to say that the sheriff wouldn't be too pleased to see Adam, and purposely intruding on the territory of a man who would really not want him there and had the skills to remove him permanently, fell into that whole monumentally asinine decision category. Of all the rotten luck. At this point in his life, he really shouldn't be surprised that the place he chose to hide out from the person who wanted him dead was run by another one who'd love to see him 6 feet south. If he survived his little situation, he really needed to look into making some changes that would minimize the chances of more people rooting for his demise. Woodson glanced around the crowd, and Adam ducked behind his horse. Damn, he needed a disguise or something. Leaving would be a better option, but the crowd had spread out enough that it would make a bigger commotion to get his horse through them than just lying low for a few minutes. He pulled off his jacket and embroidered vest and carefully wrapped his silver pocket watch inside them, then stashed the lot in his saddlebags with a sigh. That vest was brand new. It was sure to get completely wrinkled stored in his bag. He looked down at himself and then partially untucked his shirt. That wasn't much of a disguise.
"Hey, kid," Adam said, waving over a youth who'd traipsed by.
"Trade me hats." He pulled his nearly new, expertly made, and lovingly cared-for hat from his head and held it out with more than a little hesitation. "Really?" the kid said, ripping off his own oversized floppy hat and holding it out.
"Really?" Adam answered,
though he couldn't quite make himself let go. The kid frowned. "You sure you want to trade, mister?" "Yep, sure. Here you go," he said, relinquishing his hat. "Thanks, mister." The kid scampered off as fast as his feet could carry him, probably afraid Adam would take the hat back, as well he should. He looked down at the dirty hat in his hands with distaste and gingerly put it on his head. It smelled like it had sat on the head of a sweaty, dirty little boy who spent his time rolling in God knew what. On the bright side, bright was a bit bold. On the slightly optimistic side, the hat, and therefore Adam, would stand out less. And with quick-shot Woodson roaming the streets of Desolation, that was a good thing. His scraggly beard would help conceal his face. He could guarantee Woodson had never seen him with such growth before. No one had. His mother would be horrified if she saw him now. He should have listened to her and stayed in Boston and become a banker or lawyer or some other respectable citizen. Instead, he'd gone west when he was barely old enough to shave in search of adventure. He'd learned quickly enough that adventure wasn't everything it was cracked up to be. All it had left him with was a dark past he couldn't escape and a deep and abiding distrust of damn near everyone. "Let's get this over with," Woodson said. "I don't have all day." Adam flinched at the harsh voice of one of the men who'd instilled that deep and abiding distrust in him, and the last thing Adam wanted to do was let the bastard know he was in town. Before he could change his mind, he bent to rub his hands in the dirt at his feet, and then smeared it across his cheeks. His nose wrinkled, and he glanced down at his hands, fairly sure there had been something more than dirt on the ground. He shook his hands a bit, and then sighed and rubbed them down the front of his shirt. If he was going to attempt the filthy hermit disguise, he might as well fully commit. "All right, everyone who's going to, gather around. You all know the rules," Woodson said. There were nods and murmurs of assent all around him, and Adam had to keep from raising his hand like an absent-minded student who'd missed the teacher's instructions. What rules? He hadn't made it over to the sheriff's to find out what they were yet. He almost laughed again as he realized that Woodson would have been the one greeting him at that office, and Adam probably wouldn't have gotten 2 words out before he was tasting iron. No matter. This whole thing had been a horrible idea. He pulled his hat down farther. Time to get the hell out of town. Not that he had any other place to go. Maybe he could come to some terms with Woodson, or maybe he should just slip out while he still could. A grown man's body hit the ground near Adam's feet, causing several people to turn toward the sound, toward him, and he cursed the unlucky star he was born under. Chapter 2. Nora Schumacher blew her hair out of her face and glanced up at the man currently staring at her, in fascination. Or maybe it was horror. Those brown eyes were wide enough, the whites showed all the way around them, so really it could go either way. "Sorry," she muttered, turning her attention back to the heap of a man at her feet, otherwise known as her father. She'd managed to haul his considerable ass out of the tavern after several minutes of trying to rouse him had killed the hope he'd get up and walk out on his own. As a last-ditch effort, she'd even taken the remains of his beer and dumped it on his head. He hadn't even twitched. So she'd looped her arms around his chest and dragged him out of there. Barely. Getting him into the back of the wagon was another matter. She let out a long-suffering sigh. Apparently, she'd need to get someone's attention after all, and she'd really hoped to avoid that. The pity that inevitably followed was more than she could stomach even on a good day, and today was not a good day. She was strong, but lifting his dead weight was a little more than she could handle on her own. But she'd have to wait until the town's little get-together wrapped up. She sighed again, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Looks heavy," the man in front of her said, having apparently recovered his delicate sensibilities enough to speak. His eyes raked over her, from her trouser-clad legs to the open vest and tucked-in gingham shirt she'd swiped from her father's wardrobe in what she could have sworn was abject and unusual in her experience appreciation, before he returned his gaze to her face. He tipped his hat, flashing her a brilliant, gleaming smile that was completely at odds with his dingy and stinky exterior. "Excuse me?" He pointed to her father. "You'll put your back out trying to lift that." She wasn't sure whether to laugh or curse at him. "Noted. Unfortunately, I can't just leave him in the street." He frowned and rubbed his chin. "I suppose not." He looked her father over like he was appraising a side of beef at the market. "Husband?" Her eyes narrowed. "Father." "Ah." He scratched at the scraggly beard on his chin. "It's never the skinny ones who get sozzled, is it?" She choked out a sharp laugh. "No." "Any chance he'll wake up and climb back there of his own accord?" "Going by past experience," she said through a grunt. "Also no." The stranger nodded, his face set in dismayed but determined lines. "No one else around to help you?" His eyes darted to the lingering crowd forming to their right. "They're all busy," she said. "No help for it, then," he said with a grimace. "I'll have to give you a hand." She folded her arms. "I wouldn't want you to trouble yourself," she said, laying on the sarcasm as thick as his comment deserved. "Truthfully?" He leaned in a bit and lowered his voice, like he was the town gossip telling her a secret. "I wouldn't, under normal circumstances." Before she could think of an appropriate response to that eyebrow raiser, he frowned and pursed his lips. "At least, not right away. I'd have helped," he said with a placating smile. Then he shrugged. "Eventually. Most likely. Maybe. To be honest, it would have been right amusing to watch a little girl like you try and haul his considerable backside into that wagon." Nora's eyebrows hit her hairline. No one, and she meant no one, had ever called her little. She was scraping 6 feet, which made her a good hand or two taller than most men in town. Sturdier, too. A fact most of the men she'd met didn't find too attractive. The man before her had her beat, in height and muscle, but not by much. He, however, wasn't looking at her, but kept his narrowing gaze on her father. "But," he shrugged again, A man face down in the street does tend to draw attention, and since I'd like to avoid that as much as possible, you and your father's quick departure works very well in my favor. So," he gestured for her to take one of her father's arms. She sputtered, not sure how to respond, until he winked at her and gave her a half-smile that had her heart hopping around in her chest like a rabbit through a lettuce patch. The charming gesture didn't fit with the grubby man before her. Neither did the manicured nails and soft hands that grasped her father's arm. Something was definitely off with the man. As was her reaction to him. What the hell was wrong with her? She wasn't the sort to get muddle-headed by a pretty face. If there even was a pretty face under all that dirt. The bone structure was definitely there, but the rest was a bit smudged. But there was something about him that had her sitting up and paying attention, and she was too busy for that kind of nonsense. The glare she attempted to aim at him misfired, as he'd already turned away, rendering her reaction moot. She'd have to remember to glare at him doubly hard next time he looked her way. Though, maybe she'd wait until after he helped her load her father into the wagon. She did need his help, after all. "Well, come on," he said, grunting as he half-lifted her father. His tone tempted her to take her time, but her father was not a small man, and she wasn't sure how long her would-be savior could hold him. Best to get him in the wagon before the poor man's spine gave out. Her lips thinned, but she grabbed her father's other arm, and together they hefted the front half of him into the wagon. The man surprised her again by jumping into the wagon, grabbing her father under his arms, and pulling him the rest of the way in. Then he hopped down and removed his hat so he could mop his brow with a handkerchief. "Will you need help getting him back out of there?" he asked. Her eyes widened. "Are you volunteering?" "Absolutely not," he said, his eyes darting around the crowd that had grown enough that they were only a few feet from the wagon now, though no one was paying any attention to them. "No offense, but I've got my hands full trying to save my own ass," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, who stood at the front of the crowd with the preacher, who was addressing everyone, and their mayor, Mrs. DeVere. Nora didn't hear what Preacher was saying, though, as her ears were too busy ringing with the man's vehement rejection of her request. Not that it had really been a request. "If you had no intention of helping me get him out of the wagon, why did you ask if I needed help?" she said, her temper rising. He looked back at her, brows raised. "Just being friendly?" She glowered. "I'm not sure you're understanding the meaning of that word. Friendly would be helping me get him back out, not telling me you have more important things to do." "But I do. I thought women lacked honesty." He clapped his hat back on. "I already helped you once. Claiming more of my assistance is rather forward of you." "Excuse me? I didn't claim your assistance in the first place. You offered." "And you happily accepted. And I haven't heard so much as a thank you, by the way, not that I'd expect someone of your... He waved his hand toward her, implying all manner of things about her person, her upbringing, and probably a number of other attributes with that stuttering indignation of his. "My what?" she said, folding her arms and glaring at him. He snapped his mouth shut and glared back. "That's what I thought." Like he was one to talk, standing there covered in dirt and horse shit and looking and smelling like he'd spent the last month rolling around with coyotes. Not that she'd be rude enough to say so. To his face. "At the very least, you owe me an apology for your appalling behavior," he said, his tone rivaling that of the snootiest prima donna. "My what? You really think I owe you an apology?" "Yes, I do, he said, his words seeming to echo around them, though he hadn't spoken that loudly. Or maybe it was a real echo.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?